This is the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis.
There are certain decisions in broadcasting history that feel less like evolution and more like intervention. The kind where a regulator looks at a system it helped build and decides that parts of it no longer fit the picture it now has in mind. And the removal of Rediffusion London from the ITV network is one of the clearest examples of that kind of intervention, because it wasn't driven by collapse, scandal or failure, but by a strategic redesign that placed long-term structure ahead of historical contribution. And in doing so, it quietly erased one of the companies that had helped create commercial television in Britain in the first place. To really grasp how significant that was, you have to go back to the beginning of ITV itself. Because when independent television launched in September 1955, Rediffusion wasn't just one contractor among many, but the contractor that carried the weight of launching the service in the capital on weekdays, which meant it was the public face of commercial television at the exact moment it needed to prove its legitimacy, its appeal, and its ability to compete with the BBC all at once, under intense scrutiny from politicians, critics, and viewers who were not entirely convinced that advertising-funded television was a good idea. From the outset, Rediffusion operated with a sense of purpose that reflected both its corporate backing and its understanding of the responsibility it carried. Because this wasn't simply about filling airtime, but about establishing a new broadcasting culture, one that could balance commercial pressure with public expectation. And while it sometimes leaned towards a formal, even slightly establishment tone, it also demonstrated a willingness to experiment with format and style in ways that helped define the identity of ITV as something distinct from its public service rival. Over time, that identity became more confident and more varied, with Rediffusion producing a wide range of programming that included current affairs, drama, light entertainment, and youth-focused output. And it's worth pausing on that last category, because it often reveals more about a broadcaster's instinct than anything else. And in the case of Rediffusion, programmes like Ready, Steady, Go showed that it understood the cultural shift taking place in the 1960s, and was prepared to meet it head-on, rather than simply observe it from a safe distance. What fascinates me about Rediffusion during this period is the contrast between its corporate image and its creative output. Because on one hand you had a company that could appear formal, structured, and rooted in the traditions of its backers, and on the other hand you had programming that was sharp, modern, and sometimes ahead of its time. And I think that tension is part of what made it such an important player in early ITV, because it demonstrated that commercial television didn't have to choose between credibility and popularity. By the mid-1960s, however, the context in which Rediffusion operated was beginning to shift, not because it had lost its audience or its relevance, but because the Independent Television Authority was looking at the network as a whole and asking how it should evolve in the next phase of its development. And in doing so, it began to treat the franchise system less as a stable arrangement, and more as something that could be reconfigured to meet changing priorities. This is where the story becomes less about Rediffusion alone, and more about the wider structure of ITV. Because at the same time that the authority was reviewing the London franchises, it was also dealing with the future of ABC Weekend Television, a company that had built a strong reputation through its work in the Midlands and the North, but now faced the loss of its contracts due to the planned reorganisation of regional broadcasting, which effectively removed the framework in which it had been operating. ABC was not a company that the ITA wanted to lose, and that point can't be overstated because in many ways, ABC represented the kind of creative strength and production capability that the authority wanted to preserve within the network. And so the challenge became one of accommodation, finding a way to keep ABC within ITV without simply displacing another company in a way that would appear arbitrary or unjustified. The solution that emerged was the creation of a new company Thames Television, which would take over the London weekday franchise from July 1968, drawing on the resources, staff and facilities of both ABC and Rediffusion. And on paper this may have looked like a pragmatic compromise, a way of combining strengths rather than choosing between them. But in practice it created a situation in which Rediffusion was effectively being asked to surrender its identity in order to facilitate the survival of another company. It is often said that this was not a merger, but the formation of a new entity. And while that's technically accurate, it doesn't fully capture the experience from Rediffusion's perspective, because the choice it faced wasn't between equal partnership and independence, but between participation in a new structure or complete removal from the network. And that's a very different kind of negotiation, one in which the balance of power is already clear before discussions even begin. BET, the parent company of Rediffusion, found itself in a particularly difficult position, because although it secured a 49% stake in Thames, it felt that this didn't translate into equivalent influence within the management structure, leading to a sense that Rediffusion's contribution was being acknowledged in financial terms, but diluted in operational terms, and that imbalance became a source of ongoing frustration during the transition period. From a personal point of view, this is the part of the story that I find hardest to reconcile with the idea of fair restructuring, because it suggests that the outcome was not simply about creating the best possible broadcasting organisation, but about fitting existing companies into a new framework in a way that prioritised certain strengths over others. And while that may have been justified in strategic terms, it inevitably left some parties feeling that they had been treated as expendable. When the ITA made its position clear, stating that either Thames would take the contract or ABC would take over outright, the room for manoeuvre effectively disappeared, and Rediffusion's acceptance of the Thames arrangement became less a decision and more an acknowledgement of reality, because the alternative was to walk away from the London weekday franchise entirely, something that would have represented not just a business loss, but a symbolic retreat from the centre of British commercial broadcasting. The final close down of Rediffusion in July 1968 marked the end of that chapter, and while the moment itself was brief and understated, its significance was anything but, because it represented the conclusion of a broadcasting history that stretched back to the very origins of ITV, and it did so without the kind of recognition that one might expect for a company of that stature. What followed was a period of redistribution, with staff moving into Thames, London Weekend Television and other regional companies, and while employment continuity was maintained for many individuals, the sense of organisational community was lost, because Rediffusion as a distinct entity ceased to exist, its identity absorbed into a new structure that would go on to build its own reputation in the years that followed. There's also something deeply frustrating about what happened to Rediffusion's programme archive, because much of it was lost or destroyed during the transition, reflecting a broader industry practice that treated recorded material as disposable rather than valuable. And while it's easy to judge that decision with hindsight, it still feels like a significant cultural loss, particularly when you consider how much of early television history now exists, only in fragments, or not at all. Some material, though, has survived, often through unexpected routes, such as the rediscovery of At Last the 1948 show episodes in Sweden, which were later restored and released in a more complete form. And whilst these recoveries are always welcome, they also serve as reminders of how much has been lost, and how different our understanding of television history might be if preservation had been taken more seriously at the time. What I keep coming back to when I think about Rediffusion is the idea that it wasn't removed because it failed, but because it no longer fit the structure that regulators wanted to create. And that distinction matters because it challenges the assumption that survival in broadcasting is always tied to performance, when in reality it's often tied to alignment with wider strategic goals that can change over time. There is also a tendency to view Thames Television as the natural successor to Rediffusion, and in many ways it was, inheriting facilities, staff and the London weekday slot. But I think it's important to recognise that this transition was not seamless or inevitable. but the result of a deliberate decision that reshaped the network in a way that favoured certain outcomes over others, and in doing so altered the trajectory of British television history. In the end, the axing of Rediffusion London stands as a reminder that broadcasting, for all its creativity and cultural impact, is also shaped by structures, policies, and decisions that operate at a level removed from the programmes themselves, and that even the most influential organisations can find themselves vulnerable when those structures change, leaving behind a legacy that is both foundational and in some ways unfinished, because it continues to influence the system that replaced it, even as its own identity has long since disappeared.
This has been the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis, a Red Telephone Box production.